Nico Baroni walked into that hospital room like he owned it because he thought he did. He was wearing his best suit. Black Italian cut, not a wrinkle on him. He looked like a man arriving for a board meeting, not a maternity ward. His wife had been in surgery for 4 hours. His 3 sons were in incubators down the hall, each of them too small, too early, too fragile. And Nico walked in, set a manila envelope on the bedside table next to Maddie's untouched water cup, and said, "Sign these tonight. I need this done. Divorce papers," while the anesthesia was still wearing off. If you were in that bed, if that was your husband standing there, what would you do? Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next to Maddie Rowe is going to change everything you think you know about power, love, and who really holds the cards. This is her story. Don't go anywhere. The morning Maddie's water broke, she was standing at the kitchen window of the Barone estate, holding a cup of tea she hadn't touched. It was early. The kind of early where the sky hadn't decided what color it wanted to be yet. Somewhere between gray and something almost hopeful. The house was quiet. That was normal now. Nico left before she woke most days, and she'd stopped asking where he went, because the answers were always the same: meetings, business, things you don't need to worry about. She was 32 years old and 7 months pregnant with triplets, and she had spent the last 6 weeks pretending everything was fine. She wasn't fine. The tea had gone cold. She set it down too hard, and it sloshed over the rim onto the granite countertop, and she just looked at the mess for a second before she started crying. Not sobbing, just the quiet kind of crying that comes when you've been holding something and so long your body decides to let a little out without asking your permission. She'd found out about Serena Vale 11 days ago. She hadn't planned to find out. She'd gone to Nico's office at the Barone Group's downtown building to drop off papers he'd forgotten. Something mundane, something wifely, and she'd taken the private elevator that only she and Nico used. And when the doors opened, Serena was sitting on the edge of his desk in a dress that cost more than Maddie's first car, laughing at something Nico had said, and Nico's hand was on her knee. Neither of them heard the elevator. Maddie watched for 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough to understand everything she'd been trying not to understand for months. She pressed the button to close the doors. She rode back down alone. She drove home, put the forgotten papers on the kitchen table, and stood at that window with cold tea and did not say a word to anyone. 11 days, she'd spent them trying to decide what to do. Not because she was weak. She knew that about herself, she'd always known it, but because she was 7 months pregnant with 3 babies, and her options felt like a list of bad and worse. Confront him and watch him deny it. Leave and have nowhere to go. Stay and pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She'd chosen none of the above. She'd chosen to wait and think and be careful. She was still waiting when her body made the decision for her. The first contraction hit at 6:42 in the morning. She knew immediately it wasn't a Braxton Hicks. She'd had plenty of those her doctor had warned her she would, carrying multiples, and they felt different. They felt like practice. This felt like the real thing, sharp and low and wrong, too early, way too early, 8 weeks too early. And she grabbed the counter with both hands and breathed through it and reached for her phone. She called Nico. It went to voicemail after 4 rings. She called again, voicemail. She called her driver Marcus, who picked up on the first ring, because Marcus always picked up on the first ring. And she said, "I need to go to St. Catherine's now. Don't call Nico yet." She didn't know why she said that last part. She told herself it was because she didn't want to worry him over something that might turn out to be nothing. She knew, somewhere below that it was because some part of her had already started protecting herself. Marcus got her there in 14 minutes. The next 6 hours were not something Maddie could recount in any clean or orderly way afterward. They were a blur of movement and voices and pain and bright lights and someone saying words like premature and emergency and possible complications, and she kept nodding, because nodding was something she could do when everything else was beyond her. At 2:17 in the afternoon, by emergency cesarean, she became the mother of 3 boys. They put them in incubators before she could hold any of them. The smallest she'd later name him. Carter weighed 2 pounds, 3 ounces. His lungs weren't ready. None of them were really ready. They were alive, All three of them. And the doctor told her that in the tone people use when they want you to understand that alive is not the same as out of danger. She asked the nurse to call Nico. The nurse came back 15 minutes later and said he was on his way. Maddie lay in the recovery room with an IV in her arm and a surgical drain she wasn't supposed to look at, and her whole body aching in ways she hadn't known were possible, and she stared at the ceiling and waited for her husband. He arrived 2 hours later. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the hallway, low and controlled, talking to someone on his phone, even as he pushed through the door. He finished the call when he came in. He looked at her. He looked around the room. He didn't go to her. "Where are they?" he said. "NICU," she said. "Down the hall. They're Nico. They're really small." Carter? She'd named them already in her head because she'd needed something to hold on to. "I was thinking Carter, Leo, and James. For your grandfather." Something moved across his face. She'd thought it was emotion. She would later understand it was something else entirely. "I'll go see them," he said, and he left without touching her. She told herself that was grief. That was a man who didn't know how to process fear. She'd made excuses for Nico Baroni for 3 years of marriage, and she was good at it by then. She'd had practice. Came back 20 minutes later. Sat in the chair beside her bed, the one that reclined, the one the nurses had positioned there for fathers who stayed overnight. He didn't recline it. "We need to talk," he said. She was on painkillers. She was exhausted in a way that had no word for it. She'd just had surgery, and her 3 sons were fighting for their lives 40 feet away. "Can it wait?" she said. "No," he said, and that was when she knew. Not the details, she didn't know the details yet, but the shape of what was coming. She knew it the way you know bad weather before you can see the clouds. "I've had my lawyers draw up an agreement," Nico said. Kept his voice even. The way he did in business meetings. She'd heard him like this. It always meant he'd already decided, and the conversation was just paperwork. A separation agreement. "I think it's the cleanest way to handle this." "Handle what?" she said. "Us, the marriage." He looked at his hands. Not at her. "It's not working, Maddie. It hasn't been working. Think we both know that." She couldn't sit up. The surgery had her flat, and the pain was a wall she couldn't get past to reach full clarity, so everything felt like it was happening slightly underwater. But she heard him. Every word. "Our children were born 4 hours ago. I know, 2 of them have oxygen on their faces." Carter, her voice broke on his name. "Carter might need a procedure. The doctor told me this afternoon." "I know," Nico said again. "And you want to have this conversation right now. It's better to be clear." She stared at him. 32 years old, flat on her back in a hospital gown, staples in her abdomen. And she stared at the man she'd married and tried to find something in his face that looked like the person she'd believed he was. "Is this about Serena?" she said. A pause, short but real. "Not relevant. Nico, my personal life isn't the issue. The marriage isn't functional. I want to resolve it properly, with fair terms for both of us, and I want to do it before things get complicated." "Things are already complicated," she said. "We have 3 premature infants in the NICU, which is exactly why we should be clear about custody arrangements now." Custody arrangements. The words landed like something physical. What does that mean? He reached into his jacket. He was still in his suit. He hadn't even loosened the tie. She noticed that. She'd notice it for years afterward, and he pulled out an envelope and set it on the table beside her. Next to the water cup. Next to the button she pressed when she needed a nurse. "Read it when you're ready. But I need an answer within the week." "You're not serious." "I am, Nico." She heard her own voice crack and hated it. Hated that she was crying again in front of him. Hated that she'd given him that. "I just had surgery. Our boys are in there and they might not." She stopped. Breathed. "They might not all make it. Do you understand that? And you're putting papers next to my bed?" Jaw moved. Something in his eyes shifted, not regret, not exactly. More like he was calculating whether to acknowledge what she'd said. "I'm sorry about the timing." "Are you?" "Yes." "Then pick up the envelope and go be with your sons." He didn't pick up the envelope. He looked at her for a moment with that even expression, the boardroom expression, and then he said, "The agreement includes a generous financial settlement. You won't be left without resources." He stood up. "Get some rest, Maddie. I'll be back tomorrow." He left. She lay there for a long time after the door closed, listening to the sounds of the hospital around her, the beeping of monitors, distant footsteps. a PA announcement she didn't catch. She didn't touch the envelope. She looked at it the way you look at a thing that's hurt you, carefully, from a safe distance, measuring the damage. Then she pressed the nurse call button. When the nurse came in, Maddie said, "Can you tell me, are there any updates on my boys? On the NICU?" The nurse checked something on her tablet and said the overnight team was monitoring all three. That Carter was stable but still on respiratory support. That Leo and James were doing as well as could be expected for their gestational age. As well as could be expected. Maddie said thank you and closed her eyes and didn't sleep. She spent the night thinking about the 3 years of her marriage. Not the bad parts were loud enough. They didn't need excavation. She thought about the parts that had felt real. The first year when Nico had been different, or she'd believed he was. When he'd learned she took her coffee with no sugar because she'd told him once and he'd remembered. When he'd driven 4 hours to meet her at her mother's funeral because she'd called him and he'd just come, no questions, and stood beside her in the rain. She'd loved him for that. Really loved him. The kind that doesn't feel like a choice. She'd also, in her most honest moments, known things were changing. Calls he didn't explain, the trips. The way he looked at her sometimes like she was a variable in an equation he was still solving. She'd rationalized it as the pressure of running what he ran, an organization that was never fully in the light, and she'd told herself that part of marriage was deciding which things you could live with. She hadn't decided she could live with Serena, and she couldn't live with this. By 4 a.m, she had made up her mind. She was not signing anything. She was not agreeing to anything. She was not going to let Nico Baroni, or his lawyers, or his envelope, or the empire he'd built on things that didn't survive sunlight dictate what happened to her children. She just had to figure out how. 3 days after the birth, she was moved to a recovery room on the same floor as the NICU, close enough that she could be wheeled down to see the boys twice a day. They wouldn't let her hold Carter yet. She could put her hand through the porthole of his incubator and touch his fingers, and she did that every time. And he would sometimes grip her finger, his tiny reflexive grip, and she would talk to him. She talked to all 3 of them, low and quiet, just so they'd know her voice. Just so they'd have something to recognize. Nico came twice in 3 days. Both times he stood outside the incubators and watched the boys with an expression she couldn't read, and both times he looked at her with that same careful calculation, and neither time did he mention the envelope. He didn't need to. It was still sitting on her bedside table where he'd left it. She'd looked at what was inside, not the full legal text. She didn't have the clarity for that yet, but enough. Enough to know the financial settlement was designed to look generous while keeping her dependent. Enough to know the custody arrangement gave Nico authority over major decisions. Enough to know his lawyers had been working on this for a while. This hadn't been an impulse. He'd been planning this. On the 4th day, Marcus came to the hospital. Marcus had been her driver for 2 years. He was 61, built like a retired linebacker, and he didn't talk much, which she'd always appreciated. He knocked on the open door of her recovery room and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking at the floor. "Mrs. Barone," he said. "Come in, Marcus." He came in. He didn't sit. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm telling you, because I think it's right, not because of anything else." She watched him. "Okay, Mr. Barone's people came to me yesterday. Offered me a bonus, a real one. Good money to report to them about who you talk to while you're in here. Visitors, phone calls if I could hear them." He finally looked up at her. I told them no. The room was very quiet. "I'm telling you because I think you should know where things stand," Marcus said. "And because my daughter was born premature. I know what that room down the hall is like. And I don't think a woman in your position should be fighting blind." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Marcus. I'll keep bringing you whatever you need. Food, whatever. I'm not going anywhere." He left her with that. With the knowledge that Nico had already moved, was already running intelligence on her, already treating her like an adversary to be managed. She shouldn't have been surprised. This was who he was, under the part she'd loved. This was how he operated. She picked up her phone and called her own lawyer, the one she'd never had to use for anything serious. A woman named Dana Cho who handled routine things, wills and property questions. Dana answered immediately, and Maddie said, "I need a recommendation. Someone who does family law, who's aggressive and doesn't lose." Dana said, "How fast do you need a name tonight?" Pause. Then Dana said, "Okay, let me make some calls." That was Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, a man Maddie had never met knocked on her hospital room door. He was older, mid-70s, she thought, with white hair combed back from a wide forehead and a suit that was well-made but old, the kind that had been expensive once and had lasted because it was built to. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been everywhere. "Mrs. Barone," he said, "my name is Dr. Everett Langford. I was a physician retired now. I worked with your father for many years." She felt something shift in the room, something about the air. "My father's been gone for 7 years, I know." He stepped inside, looked at the envelope still on her table, looked at her. He knew, when he went, that there were things he hadn't told you, things he wanted to protect you from, and then things he wanted to make sure you had access to if you ever needed them. He set the briefcase down on the chair. "I think you need them now," she said. "What kind of things?" Everett Langford opened the briefcase. Inside were documents, organized, labeled thick. He set them on the bed beside her and said, "Your father built something after your mother died. A holding company. Private, structured specifically to be difficult to trace. He called it Roe Vanguard Holdings." She'd heard that name before. Somewhere, distantly like a sound from another room. "I thought Roe Vanguard was a real estate investment trust." "That's what the public-facing documents say," Langford said. "The true structure is considerably more complex." He paused. "It was always yours, Maddie. From the day he established it, it was built for you. He knew you wanted nothing to do with that world. You'd made that clear. So he set it up with a trustee structure that would hold everything dormant until you were ready, or until a triggering circumstance required it." "What triggering circumstance?" Langford looked at the envelope on the table, then at her. "He was specific," he said. "Specific enough that what's happened to you in the last 4 days qualifies." She looked at the documents, then back at him. "What is Roe Vanguard worth?" Told her. She sat with that for a long moment. "And Nico doesn't know," she said. "Your father was very careful about that. The Roe name is buried under 6 layers of holding structures." But Langford reached into the briefcase again and produced a single page, handed it to her. "There's something else you should know. About the Barone Group's financial history." She read the page, then she read it again. "For the last 4 years, the Barone Group's legitimate business operations, the hotels, the development projects, construction interests had been substantially funded through a chain of investment vehicles that ultimately led back to Roe Vanguard Holdings. Her father's money, her money, had been quietly propping up the empire her husband thought was entirely his. He borrowed from my father," she said quietly, "without knowing it." Without knowing it, Langford confirmed. She looked at the documents scattered across her bed. The envelope Nico had left, at her phone on the nightstand, with Marcus's number in it, and Dana chose, and the lawyer Dana was going to recommend. She looked at the door of her room, which led to the hallway, which led to the NICU, where 3 boys with her face and Nico's jaw were breathing carefully in their incubators. She thought about Nico in his black suit, setting the envelope down without touching her, without asking if she was okay, without once, not once, saying the words you say when you walk into a room where your wife has just survived surgery and your children might not. She thought about the way his hand had been on Serena's knee. She picked up her phone. "Dana," she said when Dana answered. "Change of plans. I don't need a family lawyer. I need a corporate attorney. And I need Harold Whitaker's number." She glanced at Langford, who nodded. "Don't ask me how I know that name yet. Just find him." She set the phone down, looked at Langford. "You said there was a trustee structure," she said. "What do I have to do to activate it?" "Sign 3 documents," he said. "And formally accept your identity as Maddie Elise Roe, heir to the Roe Vanguard Trust. Not Maddie Barone." "That was always a separate question," he said gently. She picked up a pen from the table. Not the pen she'd been supposed to use on Nico's envelope, a different one, her own, that a nurse had left. She looked at the documents. "Show me where," she said. Down the hall, Carter's monitors beeped steadily. Leo slept in his incubator, fists curled near his face the way babies curl them, reflexive and ancient. James had opened his eyes for the first time that morning, just briefly, just enough, and the nurse had come and told Maddie, and she'd cried in a way that had nothing to do with grief. She signed. She signed all 3 documents with her hand steady and her jaw set, and something settling into place behind her eyes that had not been there the day before. Her name, her real name, the one she'd walked away from, the one her father had built a world around, went onto the paper in ink. Maddie Elise Rowe. The woman Nico had thought he married was gone. He just didn't know it yet. Langford left the hospital at 9:47 that night. Maddie knew the exact time because she'd been watching the clock on the wall above the door, the kind of institutional clock with a red second hand that moves in small, deliberate jerks, and she'd tracked every minute of his visit the way you track things when you're trying to stay calm, and your body keeps trying to panic. After he was gone, she lay in the dark with the documents under her pillow. Not because she thought anyone would take them, not yet, but because she needed them close. Needed to feel the weight of them. Paper had never felt like much before. Right now it felt like the only solid thing in the room. She didn't sleep. At 2 a.m, Carter's alarm went off. She knew it was his because the nurses had explained the different tones to her, gently, the way they explained everything. Like information was something that needed to be rationed. She'd memorized anyway. She pressed the call button before the second alarm sounded, and a nurse came in, already moving, already knowing, and said, "He's okay." His oxygen dropped, but it came back up. "This happens. Try not to. I want to see him." "Mrs. Barone, you're not supposed to." "I want to see my son." They wheeled her down in the chair, which she hated, the helplessness of it, someone else controlling the direction and the speed. Carter was in the third incubator from the left. He was 2 pounds, 3 ounces, and he had been alive for 4 days, and he looked, in the blue light of the NICU, like something so new and so unfinished that it hurt to look at directly. She put her hand through the porthole. He gripped her finger. She sat with him for an hour while the nurses moved around her, and the monitors beeped their small insistent beeps, and the other 2 boys, Leo James, slept in their respective incubators. She talked to Carter in a voice that was barely a voice, just breath shaped into words. She told him things she'd never say anywhere else. That she was sorry he came early, that she was going to fix it, that she didn't know yet what fixing it looked like, but she was working on it. "You just keep breathing," she said to him. "That's your job. Breathing is your only job right now." His grip on her finger didn't loosen. She got back to her room at 3:15. At 3:42, her phone lit up with a text from a number she didn't recognize, Harold Whitaker. "Dana Cho sent me your number. I'd like to speak with you tomorrow morning if that's possible." "I've already spoken with Dr. Langford." She texted back, 8 a.m. Hospital room 412. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. And this time she slept, briefly and badly, because her body had reached the point where it would take what it could get. Harold Whitaker arrived at 7:58. He was shorter than she'd imagined. She'd imagined someone imposing, barrel-chested, the kind of lawyer who filled a room with sound. Whitaker was compact and quiet, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of posture that suggested he had been sitting in courtrooms for so long that straight had become the only setting he knew. He was 63, she'd learn later. He'd worked with her father for the last 11 years of the man's life, and he was, in the words Langford had used, the only person Richard Rowe fully trusted with the mechanics of what he'd built. He sat in the chair Langford had used. He set a single legal pad on his knee and uncapped a pen and said, "Tell me what's happened in the last 4 days." She told him. She told him without crying, which she was proud of, because she'd cried enough in the last week to last her a while, and she didn't want to spend this meeting in that place. She told him about the delivery, the NICU, the envelope, Nico's 2 visits, Marcus's warning about the surveillance request, and Langford's arrival. She told him about the documents under her pillow. She told him what Langford had said about Rowe Vanguard's investments in the Barone Group. Whitaker listened without interrupting. He wrote 4 things on his legal pad. That was it, the entire account, and he wrote 4 words or phrases and looked at them. "What does the custody agreement in Nico's envelopes say specifically?" he asked. "Joint legal custody with Nico as the primary decision-maker on medical and educational matters." "It's not joint custody," Whitaker said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. What about the financial settlement?" "Lump sum looks large, but it's structured as a final payment, no ongoing support. And the asset division gives him the Barone Group holdings, the estate, and both properties in his name. I keep the apartment in Westport in a figure that sounds reasonable until you do the math on what he's keeping." Whitaker nodded slowly. He had his lawyers prepare this before the birth. My read. which means he made the decision before the birth as well. He uncapped and recapped his pen. Mrs. Barone Maddie, I want to be clear about something before we go further. What your father built and what I've been custodian of for the last 7 years is significant, but activating it will be visible. Not immediately, the structure will slow that down, but within weeks, Nico will know you have resources he didn't know about. And if he has the instincts I think he has, he'll move fast. He's already moving fast, she said. Then we need to move faster. He flipped to a clean page. I'm going to need the documents Langford gave you. I'm going to need you to formally accept the trust in a notarized proceeding, which I can arrange here in the hospital. I have a notary on call. And I'm going to need you to understand that once we begin this, it doesn't stop in the middle. She pulled the documents from under her pillow. Whitaker looked at them for a moment. Something passed across his face, not surprise exactly. Something more like grief or respect or both. Your father was very thorough, he said quietly. He was, Maddie said. She hadn't talked about her father in this way in a long time. Richard Rowe had been difficult, demanding, occasionally cold, and she'd spent years being angry at him for the empire he'd built and the way it had swallowed her childhood. She'd walked away from it at 24 and told herself she was choosing something real over something built on money and power. She'd married Nico Barone, which, in retrospect, had not been the straightforward escape she'd thought. He would have hated this, she said, what Nico did. He would have, she stopped. He tried to tell me, before he died, that Nico wasn't what I thought. We fought about it. I told him he was wrong. She looked at the window. I told him he didn't know how to love someone without trying to control them. Whitaker didn't say anything. Start the notarization, she said. Today, Nico came at noon. He arrived the way he always arrived, ahead of schedule, without warning, expecting that his timeline would become everyone else's timeline because it always had. He pushed the door open and stopped when he saw Harold Whitaker sitting in the chair with the legal pad. The two men looked at each other. Who are you? Nico said. Whitaker said Harold Whitaker. I'm Mrs. Barone's attorney. Pause. Short, very controlled. Maddie has an attorney. She has a new one, Whitaker said pleasantly. Nico looked at Maddie. She looked back at him. She had been waiting for this moment, had been both dreading and needing it, and now that it was here she was surprised by how steady she felt. The painkillers helped. The 4 hours of sleep helped more. What helped most was the knowledge of what she'd signed at 9 the previous night, after the notary had come and gone, after Whitaker had left and she'd been alone with the documents and the pen. She had signed her name, her real name, and something had shifted in the room that hadn't shifted back. I'll come back, Nico said. You don't have to, she said. Mr. Whitaker was just leaving. Whitaker gathered his legal pad and stood without urgency. He nodded at Nico, not warmly, not hostilely, just the nod of a man who has done this particular thing many times and knows exactly what it means, and left. Nico closed the door. He stood with his back to it for a moment. Then he moved to the chair and sat and looked at her. She waited. Where did you find him? He found me. That's not an answer. It is, actually. His jaw tightened. She'd seen that jaw 1,000 times, the precise mechanics of it, the way his back teeth pressed together when he was controlling something he didn't want to show. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm making it what it actually is, she said. You filed for divorce while I was in recovery. You tried to bribe my driver. You had custody papers prepared before our sons were born. That's not hard. Nico, that's just true. The temperature in the room dropped about 5 degrees. Marcus talked to you, he said flatly. I'm glad he did. He's going to have a problem. Touch Marcus and I will make sure that problem is the least of yours. She said it quietly, without theater, and she watched his eyes to see if he understood she meant it. He did, she could tell he did. Leave him alone. He has a daughter. Nico looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Where is the envelope? In the drawer. She nodded toward the bedside table. I haven't signed it. I can see that. I'm not going to sign it. Another pause, longer. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, and for a moment she saw something she hadn't expected, not anger, not the calculation, but something underneath both of those, something that might have been, in another man, in another life, genuine pain. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away. Maddie, he said, I'm trying to give you a clean exit. The settlement is fair. The settlement is designed to look fair. and the custody arrangement protects the boys. It gives you control of medical decisions while they're in the NICU, she said. Nico, they're in the NICU. Carter is on respiratory support. And your lawyers wrote an agreement that would give you the authority to override my medical decisions for our children. She watched his face. Did you even read what they wrote? He didn't answer immediately. Did you? I reviewed the key terms. Then you know what it says. Stood up. The controlled energy of him filled the room differently. When he was standing, he was a big man, Nico. Not in a loud way, but in the way of someone who had learned very early that his size was something people noticed. And he had learned to use that noticing. She'd found it attractive once. Right now she found it exhausting. I'm going to see the boys, he said. They're your sons, too, she said. Go. He went. She watched the door close, and then she picked up her phone and texted Whitaker. He's here. He knows about Marcus. Watch the timeline. Whitaker responded in 40 seconds, already on it. Don't sign anything. Don't let him take any original documents. She put the phone face down on the blanket and stared at the ceiling. The boys were 7 days old. The call from Nico's lawyer came 2 days later. She was in the middle of a feeding attempt, not nursing. The NICU team had established a careful supplementation plan, but she was there, present, doing the work of being present, when her phone buzzed. Caller ID, said Reese & Partners, which was the name of the firm she'd seen on the envelope's return address. She let it ring. She finished what she was doing with Carter, who was showing fractional improvements. The NICU nurse had used the word encouraging that morning, with the careful precision of someone who knew what false hope cost. And she stayed until his eyes closed, and then she wheeled herself back to her room and called them a number. A man's voice, smooth, professional, the voice of someone paid to sound reasonable while being the opposite. Mrs. Barone. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Barone's legal team. We wanted to follow up on the separation agreement. I'm not signing the agreement, she said. A beat. We understand there may be questions. There aren't questions. I'm not signing it, Mrs. Barone. I want to make sure you're aware that Mr. Barone has the right to pursue emergency custody proceedings. He can pursue whatever he'd like, she said. Good day. She hung up. She texted Whitaker the transcript from memory. He called her back in under a minute. They're filing for emergency custody, he said. It wasn't a question. Probably. Okay. I need you to do something that's going to feel wrong. What? I need you to request a formal conference with the NICU medical team. Full care conference, you, the neonatologist, the nursing team. I need documentation, in the hospital's records, that you are the engaged, present, primary caregiver. Before his lawyers get anything in front of a judge, I want your name on every care note, every meeting, every decision. She'd already been doing all of those things. She'd been there every day, twice a day minimum, asking every question, learning every term, memorizing every number. But she understood what Whitaker was saying. Doing the right thing and being seen doing the right thing were not the same thing, and right now she needed them to be. I'll call the team today, she said. Good, one more thing. He paused. Serena Vale. The name sat between them on the phone line. What about her? Maddie said. She's been issuing statements to the press. Nothing direct, yet she's careful. She knows what she can't say legally, but there's a narrative being built. The separation is mutual, Nico as a concerned father. You as a woman who's struggling after a high-risk delivery. Struggling, she repeated. The word they're using is fragile. She was quiet for a moment. How public has this gotten? So far it's in the gossip vertical of 2 business publications. The Barone name sells papers. Once the custody filing becomes public record, it'll move faster. She thought of Carter's finger gripping hers, of Leo's fists. James opening his eyes. Can we get ahead of it? She said. Yet. If you make a statement now, it confirms the story exists. We need to wait until we have something that changes the entire frame. A pause. That's coming. I'm working on it. But we need a few more days. Okay, she said. A few more days. They were not a few more quiet days. On day 9, Leo developed respiratory complications. Maddie was in the room when the alarms went off, and she watched with her hands gripping the arms of the wheelchair while the NICU team moved around him with the specific controlled urgency that means something is wrong. But we know what to do, and she was wheeled back by a nurse who said, You need to let them work, Mrs. Barone, and she let herself be wheeled back because she understood that arguing was not useful, and useful as the only thing she could afford to be. She sat outside the NICU glass and waited for 40 minutes. When the neonatologist came out, Dr. Priya Okafor, a woman in her 50s with a direct gaze that Maddie had come to trust, she said, Leo had responded to intervention, that his oxygen was back up, that they'd adjusted his support, that she wanted to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. Is he going to be okay? Maddie said. Right now he's stable, Okafor said. That's what we have. Nico arrived 40 minutes after that. She didn't know how he'd found out, probably one of the nurses. Probably someone in the building whose loyalty went in the direction his money went. He had those people everywhere. She'd understood that about him, long before she'd understood other things. Came in fast, without the suit this time, in a jacket and dark pants, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Scared, not performing scared. Actually scared. The way it looks on someone who doesn't usually show it, rigid and white around the eyes, jaw set hard. Where is he said, stable. Dr. Okafor just spoke to me. I want to talk to her. She went back in. He went to the glass. Stood there. Looked at his 3 sons in their incubators. Maddie watched him from the chair, watching the back of his neck, the set of his shoulders. He put one hand flat on the glass. She wanted to hate him completely. It would have been easier. She didn't say anything. Neither did he for a long time. Then he said, without turning, I didn't want this. The early delivery, I know, she said. I want them to be okay. So do I. He turned then, looked at her. Something in his face was open in a way it almost never was, and she knew because she'd loved him, because she still understood him, even when she didn't want to, that this was one of the only moments she'd ever see him this way. The fear had cracked something open, and real was leaking out. Maddie, he said. Don't, she said quietly. I need to. Don't. She held his gaze. Not right now. Not while they're in there. Whatever you need to say about us, you can say it through Rice and partners. But right now we're just parents. That's all we are. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. And turned back to the glass. They stood like that, him standing, her in the chair for another 20 minutes. Not speaking. Just watching their sons breathe. It was the closest thing to honest they'd been in months. Didn't last. The custody filing came through on day 11. Whitaker called her at 7 in the morning. It's filed. Emergency custody motion, citing concerns about your mental and physical capacity to make medical decisions post-surgery. They've attached a declaration from Nico's physician, not the NICU team. His own private physician, who's never examined you, stating that the physical demands of a cesarean section, combined with the stress of a NICU situation, may create cognitive impairment. She sat up. The surgical site pulled. She breathed through it. His private doctor, correct. A doctor who has never met me, also correct. She thought of Okafor, of the care conferences she'd requested, of the notes she'd made sure were in the record. When is the hearing? 4 days. I've filed for an expedited response. I need you to get Okafor to submit a statement formal, in your chart about your engagement with the care team. Everything you've done, every meeting, every question. She'll do it, Maddie said. She was confident about that. Okafor was not a woman who would submit to a political demand from anyone in a suit. One more thing. Whitaker's voice shifted. They've also filed a motion to restrict your independent authority over the boy's care. What they're calling a joint consent requirement, meaning any medical decision above routine care, requires Nico's sign-off as well as yours. The room went very still. They're trying to slow down Carter's procedure, she said. Carter was scheduled for a minor surgical intervention in 6 days. Not optional, the NICU team had been clear about the timeline. A joint consent requirement with lawyers involved could create delays of days or weeks. Yes, Whitaker said. That's what this is. She thought about Nico standing at the NICU glass with his hand flat against it, scared for his sons. She thought about the careful, real fear on his face. She thought about a man who could be genuinely afraid for his children in the morning and file a motion to delay their medical care in the afternoon. Harold, she said, I want to activate the Roe Vanguard authority over the Barone Group investments. The full mechanism. Today, silence on the line. That will escalate things considerably, he said carefully. I know. Once we do that, he'll know. He'll know everything. He's filing motions to delay my son's surgery, she said. He already made his choice. Another pause. Longer. She could hear Whitaker breathing on the other end, measured and deliberate, a man running calculations. Maddie, he said, if I trigger the Roe authority this week, you need to be ready for a full-scale war. Not a custody dispute. Not a divorce proceeding. I'm talking about his entire organization coming at you. His legal team, his business contacts, and whatever else the Barone name can mobilize. She looked at the window, at the daylight coming through the blinds in thin parallel lines. I have 3 sons in incubators, she said. I have already been at war. He just didn't tell me we were fighting. Whitaker was quiet. Do it, she said. He exhaled. I'll make the call this afternoon. She hung up, set the phone down on the blanket, put both hands flat on her thighs, and felt the scratch of the hospital gown fabric, and breathed steadily, in and out, the way she'd taught herself to breathe, through contractions which hadn't helped then, but the practice was the same. Find the thing you can control. Control only that. She could control the next decision, the next phone call, the next document she put her name to. Nico Barone had spent 3 years believing he knew who she was. He was about to meet the woman who had actually been there the whole time. Serena Vale saw the first signal at 4:18 that afternoon. She was in the offices of the Barone Group's communications division. She kept a desk there, had for 2 years, technically a consultant, but practically something else. And she'd spent the morning refining the statement she intended to release through 2 friendly journalists once the custody filing became public record. The statement was careful, empathetic toward Maddie in the way that makes empathy feel like pity. It positioned Nico as a devoted father making difficult decisions during a complicated family situation. It had taken Serena 4 drafts, and it was good. She knew it was good because she was good at this, better than anyone Nico employed, and he knew it too, which was one of several reasons she'd lasted as long as she had. She saw it first as a flag in the financial monitoring system she'd set up. She monitored everything. That was the job. That was also the instinct to change in the ownership notation on one of the Barone Group's capital investment vehicles. Not a major change. The kind of change that looked administrative. The kind of change that, if you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd mark as routine and move past. Serena Vale always knew what she was looking for. She pulled up the full record. Traced the change back 2 levels. Hit a holding company name she didn't recognize. Pulled the registration on that holding company. Hit another name below it. She sat very still at her desk for approximately 40 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Nico. He answered on the second ring. What? I need you to come to the office, she said. Now. Not tonight now. I'm in the middle of Nico. She kept her voice level, because keeping her voice level was how she communicated severity. He'd learned that about her. Come now. She hung up and pulled up a second screen. Started running the trace from the other direction, following the investment chain forward instead of back, seeing how deep it went. By the time Nico walked through her office door 18 minutes later, she had a partial map of it on her screen, enough to understand the shape of what it was. Not all of it, whoever had built this structure, had been very deliberate, very patient, but enough. He came and stood behind her and looked at the screen. She let him look. She watched his reflection in the darkened corner of the monitor. Watched his face do the thing it almost never did go, completely, genuinely blank. The way a face goes when the information it's receiving doesn't have a category yet. What is this, he said. Roe Vanguard Holdings, she said. Have you ever heard of it? A beat. No. Your capital investment vehicle, the one that funded the Meridian project, the coastal development, the hotel acquisitions in 21, traces back to it. 6 layers up, but it traces back. His reflection didn't move. This entity, she said, appears to have been formally activated this afternoon, which triggered a reporting requirement in the holding structures. Which is why I caught it. She paused. Nico Roe Vanguard Holdings. Roe. He looked at the screen. She watched him get there. Watched him trace the letters, Roe. Roe Vanguard. His wife's name was Roe, her maiden name. The one she'd set aside, the one she'd told him she'd walked away from. Maddie Roe, who'd grown up in wealth she claimed not to want, who'd met him at a gallery opening, who'd laughed at his jokes, who'd said yes when he asked. How much, he said. His voice was very flat. Serena told him. He put one hand on the edge of her desk. And it's connected to us, he said. Your legitimate business operations have been partially capitalized by money that was always hers, Serena said. Which means legally, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough legally, She may have a claim on assets you believed were solely yours. The hand on her desk pressed down. She could see the tendons in it. She knew, he said. I don't think she knew, Serena said. The activation happened today. If she'd known, she wouldn't have waited. And someone told her, yes. While she was in the hospital, he straightened. While I was filing, he stopped. Serena looked at him. She had been beside Nico Barone for 2 years, and she knew him in the way you know someone, when your survival depends on reading them accurately. She knew when he was performing and when he wasn't. Right now he was not performing. He was understanding for the first time that he had made a serious miscalculation. What do we do, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the screen, at the name on it. Find out everything about Roe Vanguard, he said. Everything. Who set it up? Who's been running it? What it holds? What authority she just activated? He moved toward the door. And find out who helped her. He walked out. Serena turned back to her screen, started typing. She told herself she was in control of this. She told herself she'd managed worse. She told herself a lot of things in the next few minutes, and none of them fully drowned out the things she'd noticed in Nico's face when he left the room. Not anger. She'd have known what to do with anger. This was something colder. This was a man recalculating what kind of war he was actually in. Whitaker called her at 6:41 the next morning. She was already awake. She'd been awake since 4, which had become her pattern. Her body had decided that 4 in the morning was when the night ended, regardless of what she wanted, and she'd stopped fighting it. She used the time. She read the documents Langford had left her. She made notes in a small spiral notebook a nurse had brought her because she'd asked for paper and a pen, and the nurse hadn't questioned it. She thought about the boys. She thought about what came next. When the phone rang, she picked up immediately and said, "Tell me." Whitaker said he knows. She exhaled slowly. How much? Enough. My contact at the filing office says Rice and Partners submitted an emergency injunction request at 11 last night. They're asking a judge to freeze any asset transfers associated with Roe Vanguard pending investigation of what they're calling fraudulent concealment. Fraudulent concealment, she repeated. They're arguing you hid your financial identity from Nico during the marriage. That the marriage itself was entered under false pretenses. She sat with that for a moment. Let herself feel the particular quality of it, the way it flipped the truth upside down and held it there, so smoothly that someone who didn't know better might believe it. He hid things from me for 3 years, she said. Yes, Whitaker said, but he has lawyers who are filing first. Can they freeze the trust? They can attempt to. The trust structure is specifically designed to resist that your father's attorneys spent considerable time on exactly this kind of scenario. But a judge could issue a temporary freeze while they review the merits, and that could take. How long? Weeks, possibly longer. Carter's procedure was in 5 days. Harold, she said. I know, he said. I'm working on it. I've already filed a counter motion, and I've contacted the Roe Vanguard trustees directly. There's a mechanism in the trust for exactly this situation, an emergency authorization clause that protects medical expenditure from any freeze order. I need to activate it through the trust board. How long does that take? I'm calling them at 7 this morning. It depends on whether I can get a quorum. She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Get a quorum, Harold, I will. There's something else. A pause that she had already learned to read. Whitaker paused when the next thing was something he'd rather not say. Serena Vale released a statement this morning, 40 minutes ago. It went to 4 outlets simultaneously. She closed her eyes. What does it say? He read it to her. It was 3 paragraphs. The first positioned the separation as something both parties had acknowledged was necessary, the natural conclusion of a marriage that had grown difficult. The second expressed Nico's deep concern for the welfare of his sons and his commitment to being present for them through the challenges of their early arrival. The third, and this was where Serena had done her best work, Maddie could feel the craft in it. The precision of each word chosen expressed gentle concern for Maddie's well-being during what must be an extraordinarily difficult time, and noted that the Barone family hoped she would accept the support of medical professionals during her recovery. Medical professionals during her recovery. She's calling me unstable, Maddie said. Not in those words. That's exactly what she's doing. She's seeding the narrative so that anything I do next reads as erratic. She opened her eyes. She's good, she is, Whitaker agreed, which is why we need to be better. After she hung up, she sat for a while doing nothing, which was not something she allowed herself often. She sat and felt the weight of what was stacked against her, the injunction, the custody motion, the narrative Serena was building in the press, Carter's procedure ticking down, Leo's fragile oxygen levels, Nico's lawyers working through the night, and she let herself feel all of it, the full crush of it, because she'd learned that pretending it wasn't heavy didn't make you stronger. It just made you surprised when your legs gave out. Her legs were not going to give out. She picked up the notebook, wrote 3 things. Then she called Dr. Okafor's direct line, which Okafor had given her personally, a gesture Maddie had understood was unusual and had not taken lightly. Okafor answered on the 3rd ring, the slightly compressed voice of someone who was already in the middle of something. Mrs. Baroni. I need to tell you something before you hear it from anyone else, Maddie said. There's a legal filing from my husband's team that may attempt to create a joint consent requirement for the boy's care, including Carter's procedure. A beat. I'm aware there's a custody dispute. It's going to become more complicated this week. I wanted you to know because if anyone approaches you, his lawyers, anyone from his team, I want you to hear my version first. What is your version? Okafor said in the tone of a woman who preferred facts to versions. That I have been here every day, that I've been at every care conference, that I've made every decision in consultation with your team and followed every recommendation, and that the only reason there's any question about my fitness as a decision maker is because my husband's lawyers wrote a motion that they paid someone to sign. Silence for a moment. Then Okafor said, I've already submitted a statement to the hospital's legal department about your engagement with the care team. I did it yesterday, after the motion was filed. A pause. I don't involve myself in marital disputes, but I do involve myself when legal filings attempt to slow down medical care for patients in my unit. Maddie exhaled. Thank you, Carter's procedure date stands, Okafor said. I don't care what anyone files. My job is those 3 boys. She hung up and wrote Okafor's name in the notebook and underlined it twice. Then her door opened without a knock. Nico walked in and he was not wearing the mask today. She'd seen him in many states over 3 years. She'd seen him charming and cold and controlled, and briefly, the night before, genuinely frightened. She had not seen him, like this stripped of the professional surface, moving through the room with something that was close to rage, but not quite rage, closer to the thing that lives underneath rage. Place where a person is running on exposed wire. Closed the door. Didn't sit, row vanguard, he said. She held his gaze. Yes, your father's company. My company, she said. My father built it for me. He looked at her. She watched him look at her the way you watch someone. Look at a place they thought they knew and are realizing they've never been to. How long have you known? Dr. Langford came to me 4 days ago. You didn't know before. No, I'm supposed to believe that. You can believe whatever is useful to you, she said. It doesn't change what's true. He moved just 2 steps, not toward her, lateral. The way he moved in his office when he was thinking through something difficult, and she tracked him, without turning her head, watched from the edge of her vision. The investment chain, he said. Did your father know? When he invested in the Barone Group, did he know it was me? She hadn't thought about that. She turned it over quickly. Richard Rowe had not approved of Nico, had said so clearly before he died. Had tried to tell her something, and she'd refused to hear it. I don't know, she said. Because if he knew if this was a deliberate... I said, I don't know, Nico. It doesn't matter, he said almost to himself. It doesn't matter because either way the structure exists, and your lawyers have activated it, and my attorneys are telling me that it creates a legitimate claim on assets I've operated as solely mine for 4 years. He stopped moving, looked at her directly. What are you trying to do? Protect my children. By gutting my company. By making sure Carter's procedure happens on schedule, she said. Your lawyers filed a motion that could delay it. I activated the trust to protect his medical authorization from that delay. That is what I did, and that is why I did it. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, she'd stopped expecting guilt from him, but something adjacent to it. Comfort. The look of a man who has ordered something, and then had to watch the delivery. The motion wasn't about Carter, he said. Then what was it about? He didn't answer. The motion, she said slowly, was about controlling me. About making sure that before any judge looked at our custody situation, you had established yourself as the necessary decision-maker. even if that meant putting legal friction between my son and his surgery. She kept her voice even. Even was the only way she could say this without breaking. You used Carter as a bargaining chip. That's not. Nico, her voice cut through his. Don't. The room was very quiet. He looked at the window. His jaw worked. Then he said, I'll have Rice withdraw the joint consent motion. She looked at him, measuring. I'll have them withdraw it today, he said. Carter's procedure, I'm not trying to interfere with that. Then why file it? He didn't answer again, which was, she realized, its own kind of answer. He'd filed it because his lawyers had told him it was leverage, and he'd said yes without fully thinking through what it meant. And now that he was in this room, looking at the woman who'd been in surgery, 4 days before his sons were in incubators, he was having trouble living inside the logic. She didn't feel triumphant about that. She felt tired. Thank you, she said. For withdrawing it, he nodded once. The rest of the filing stands, he said. Then he left. She sat with the quiet after the door closed. She thought about calling Whitaker. She would in a minute. First, she just sat. The problem with Nico Barone, she thought, the real problem, the one she'd spent 3 years not looking at directly, was that he was not simply a villain. Villains were easier. Nico was a man who was capable of real things, real fear, real love once. She believed that. She'd had to believe it, and also capable of the cold mechanics she'd seen in the last 2 weeks. Both of those things were true, and they lived in the same person, and that was the part that made her chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. Called Whitaker. He said the joint consent motion had already been flagged for withdrawal on the court system. Nico had called Rice before he'd even left the hospital floor. That's something, Whitaker said. Is it enough? For Carter, yes. For everything else, he paused. Maddie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay steady. She tightened her grip on the phone. Tell me. I've been going through the Roe Vanguard investment records. The full chain, not just what we've disclosed to activate the trust. And I found something. He breathed. Your father didn't invest in the Barone Group by accident. She felt the first cold touch of something she didn't have a name for yet. What do you mean? The investment was directed, deliberately routed through the holding chain into specific Barone Group vehicles. It started in 2019, a year before you married Nico. She did the math without wanting to. Before we were married. Yes. So my father was watching Nico Barone before you were, Whitaker said, and chose to invest. Why would he invest in a man he didn't approve of? The pause that followed was the longest Whitaker had given her. I don't think he invested because he approved, he said carefully. I think he invested because he wanted a mechanism. A legal thread he could pull if he ever needed to. A financial relationship that would give the Roe family standing in any dispute involving the Barone organization. Stared at the wall. He knew, she said. He knew before the wedding that something might go wrong. I think he was being careful, Whitaker said, in the way that cautious men with resources are careful. He couldn't stop you from marrying Nico, you'd made that clear. So he made sure that if the worst happened, you wouldn't be standing on Nico's ground. You'd be standing on your own, she thought about her father. About the last conversation they'd had before he died, the argument, the things she'd said about control and manipulation and letting people make their own choices. Thought about how certain she'd been that she was right and he was wrong. He never told me, she said. No, because if he'd told me, I would have... Yes, Whitaker said gently. I think he understood that. She put the notebook down on the blanket, looked at the ceiling. Richard Roe had built her a trap door, had built it quietly without telling her, because he'd known she'd refuse it if he told her it was there. Made sure it existed. And 7 years after his death, in a hospital room 40 feet from 3 boys in incubators, she'd fallen through it and landed on something solid. She didn't know whether to be furious at him or grateful. She realized both. There's more, Whitaker said. She'd known there was more. There was always more. This week, the information came in layers, each one revealing a layer below. The investment records show a second set of transactions, Whitaker said, starting in 2021, 2 years after your father's original position. A separate capital infusion into the Barone Group, not through Roe Vanguard. Through a different vehicle entirely. Different how. Different ownership. Different structure. But the same investment chain using the same intermediary firms, routed through the same offshore vehicles. He paused. The secondary investment is larger than your father's original position. Who controls it? A breath. That's what I've been trying to determine. The ownership is extremely well obscured. But the intermediary firms, 2 of them, appear in both the Roe Vanguard chain and in Barone Group's own private capital records. She went very still. Harold, she said, say what you're saying. I'm saying, he said, carefully, that there may be a third party who has been investing in the Barone Group. Someone not of both the Roe Vanguard structure and the Barone Group's internal finances. Someone who understood the existing relationship between the 2 organizations and used it. He paused once more. Someone inside. The word landed in the room, like something dropped from a height. Inside. She thought about Nico's organization. About the people who moved around him, the ones she'd met, the ones she'd never met, the ones she'd always understood were there without being told they existed. She thought about who would have known enough about both sides of this, the Roe family finances and the Barone Group's internal structures, to build a secondary investment chain between them. Then she thought about a woman in a dress that cost more than her first car, sitting on the edge of a desk. Laughing. Serena, she said. Whitaker was quiet for 4 seconds. I can't confirm that yet, he said. But the timeline fits. She's been in Nico's inner circle for 3 years. She would have had access to the Barone Group's financial records. If she also had access to information about the Roe family. Could she have known about my father's investment? Before I did. If she was thorough enough, Whitaker said slowly, and she had the right contacts, it's possible. The Roe Vanguard position wasn't completely invisible. It was designed to be difficult to trace, not impossible. Someone with financial sophistication and time. She's been building a position, Maddie said. The shape of it was assembling itself in her mind, piece by piece, the way you assemble something you don't want to look at directly. In the Barone Group, using Nico's infrastructure, using money routed through channels that look like they belong to other people. The records suggest. And if the Roe Vanguard trust gets frozen, if the injunction Nico filed succeeds, then the primary investment structure collapses, Whitaker said. And whatever secondary position she's built, he stopped, becomes the dominant financial relationship. Maddie finished. She gets the leverage over Nico's entire operation. The silence between them was very full. She's not just his mistress, Maddie said. No, Whitaker said. I don't think she ever was. She sat with that for a moment. The machinery of it. The patience it required 3 years, minimum. Maybe longer if she'd been watching before she'd moved into Nico's orbit. The particular kind of intelligence that doesn't show itself, that presents as something useful and adjacent and slightly dazzling, and works quietly underneath. She thought about Nico's face when he'd looked at the screen in Serena's office. The blankness of it, the way he'd gone somewhere internal and very cold. He hadn't known either. She almost felt something for him in that. The recognition of it, the particular brand of blindness that comes from being too close to something for too long. Does Nico know? She said. I don't believe so. Not yet. If he finds out through his own people, he'll be looking for someone to hold responsible, Whitaker said. And you'll be the nearest target. Yes, she said. She looked at the notebook, at the 3 things she'd written that morning, which now felt like they'd been written by a person operating with incomplete information. She picked up the pen, wrote a 4th thing. Tell him first. Harold, she said, I need you to prepare a summary of what you've found. The secondary investment chain, the intermediary firms, everything we can document right now. I want it ready by tomorrow morning. What are you going to do with it? She looked at the door, thought about Nico in the hallway, walking back to whatever car was waiting for him, carrying the knowledge that his life had been structured differently than he'd believed. I'm going to tell him, she said. Whitaker made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Almost a laugh, not amused, just the involuntary release of someone surprised by a move they hadn't anticipated. You're going to tell Nico Baroni that his mistress has been building a financial position inside his organization. Yes. Why? Because he's going to find out, she said. And when he does, it needs to be from me. Not because I owe him, I don't. But because the person who gives him this information gets to be the person who wasn't lying to him. And right now, I need at least one thing between us that isn't a weapon. A long pause. Then Whitaker said that's either very smart or very dangerous. Both, she said. Have the summary ready. She set the phone down. She thought about Serena Vale's statement, released that morning. Precise empathy of it. Concern for Maddie's well-being. The way it had been constructed to sound like kindness and function like a blade. She thought about 3 years of a woman being present in her husband's life. Being trusted. Being let close enough to see everything worth seeing. She thought about patience. About the kind of game that requires you to play the long hand and never show it. She understood that kind of patience. She'd spent the last 2 weeks discovering she understood it better than she'd known. She thought up what Serena had been building, and she thought about the fact that Serena did not yet know that Maddie had found it. That was the only card she held that Serena didn't know existed. She had to play it before that changed. She picked up the phone again. This time she called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Barone, Marcus, I need you to find out something for me, and I need you to be careful about how you find it out." She paused. "Do you know Serena Vale's schedule? Whether she's been in the Barone Group offices this week?" "A beat. I can find out. I need to know where she is tomorrow morning. Not generally, specifically. What building, what time?" Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking, rather than hesitating. "I can get that. Thank you." She hung up and lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would see Nico. She would put Whitaker's summary in front of him. She would watch his face when he understood what Serena had done. She would watch the man who had betrayed her process, the betrayal that had been running underneath his, patient and structural, and far more deliberate than anything Nico had managed. She would watch the feared Mafia boss understand that the woman he'd trusted most had been the most dangerous person in the room. And then, and this was the part she couldn't fully plan for, could only prepare for, she would watch him decide what to do with that. What Nico Baroni did with that information would determine everything that came next. She closed her eyes. Down the hall, Carter breathed in his incubator. Leo slept with his fists curled. James had opened both eyes twice today, the nurse had told her, and tracked a light for almost 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds more than yesterday. 4 seconds more than yesterday. She repeated that to herself until the thing in her chest loosened slightly. That was all you needed. 4 seconds more than yesterday. A little more ground than you had before. A slightly better number. A decision made before the other person made theirs. She had until tomorrow morning. She opened the notebook. Started writing. She didn't sleep that night either. Not the way she hadn't slept before the anxious wakefulness of the first days, lying there cataloging fears. This was different. This was deliberate. She sat up in the hospital bed with the notebook and Whitaker's preliminary summary, which he'd sent to her secure email at 11:45, and she read it 4 times. Each time she read it, she understood something new. The secondary investment chain was elegant in the way that very patient things are elegant, not flashy. Nothing that would catch the eye on casual inspection. Just a series of small decisions made over time that accumulated into something significant. Serena Vale had been building toward this for at least 2 years. Possibly longer. Maddie thought about the kind of mind that worked that way. The discipline of it. Playing a role-trusted advisor, visible mistress, indispensable presence, while simultaneously constructing a parallel position that would eventually supersede the role itself. Letting Nico believe he was the one with leverage over her when she'd been building leverage over him the entire time. She thought about Nico, about what it was going to look like on his face when he understood. At 3 a.m, she stopped reading and just sat with the dark outside the window and the distant sounds of the hospital around her, and she let herself feel the full shape of what the next day was going to require. She was going to walk into a room with the man who had betrayed her and hand him a weapon that would redirect his fury away from her. Not because he deserved the help, because she needed him aimed in the right direction before the board meeting. Yes, the board meeting. Whitaker had confirmed it at 9 the previous night, his voice carrying the tight precision of someone delivering bad news with full professional composure. The Roe Vanguard board had been contacted by Rhesus and Partners. Nico's lawyers had moved faster than she'd anticipated, which she should have anticipated, and had submitted documentation to the board arguing that Maddie's activation of the trust was irregular, potentially unauthorized, and that until the legal dispute was resolved, the board should consider suspending her authority as trust heir. The board had agreed to convene, not to decide not yet, but to hear arguments. The meeting was in 3 days. She had 3 days to keep the trust intact, get Carter through his procedure, and find a way to stand in front of a room of her father's former associates and convince them that she was the right person to hold what he'd built. She'd spent 20 minutes after Whitaker's call sitting with the impossibility of it. Then she'd started writing in the notebook. At 6 in the morning, she called Whitaker and gave him the list. 7, she called Marcus. At 7:45, Okafor came in for morning rounds and told her that Carter's numbers were holding, that Leo's oxygen had been stable for 36 hours, that James was, in Okafor's careful language, showing encouraging progress. Maddie listened to every word with the complete attention she'd trained herself to give to these reports. Nothing filtered, nothing minimized, and then she said, "Carter's procedure is still on for day after tomorrow?" "It is," Okafor said. "And the withdrawal of the joint consent motion, is that confirmed in the hospital's records?" "Confirmed." Okafor looked at it with the steady gaze that Maddie had come to think of as the doctor's version of a handshake, a signal of something solid. "Go do what you need to do," she said. "I have them." Maddie changed out of the hospital gown for the first time in 11 days. Marcus had brought clothes. She'd asked him to go to the estate, he still had access. No one had thought to revoke that and bring her something specific. Not what she'd been wearing before the birth, not the soft things she'd packed for a hospital bag. She'd been precise about what she wanted, and he'd gotten it right, because Marcus was good at his job and was also at reading the weight of a request. She put on a dark gray blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers that still fit mostly. Her own shoes, not the hospital slippers. She sat at the small mirror above the hospital room's sink and looked at her face for a long moment. She'd lost weight. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't going anywhere. The surgical pallor was still on her, the particular gray-white of someone whose body had been through something significant. She didn't put on enough makeup to hide it. She put on enough to make clear she'd chosen her face today. There was a difference. She called Nico at 8:15. He answered after 3 rings, "Maddie." "I need to see you," she said. "Morning." "Not at the hospital, I need neutral ground." "There's something you need to know, and I need to tell you in person." Pause. She could hear him in it, measuring, trying to determine what category this fell into. Is it about the boys? They're stable, this is something else. She kept her voice even. "Nico, I'm not calling to fight with you. I have information, and it concerns your organization. And I'm telling you before you find it somewhere else." Pause was longer this time. "There's a conference room on the 2nd floor, he said finally. "The hospital uses it for family meetings. I can be there at 10. "Fine." She hung up and sat for a moment, both hands flat on her thighs, feeling the fabric of the trousers and the realness of solid ground under her feet instead of a bed frame. She was upright. She was dressed. She was going to walk into a room and do a thing she'd never done before, and she was going to do it clearly, without hesitation, because hesitation was not something she could afford. Whitaker arrived at 9:15, and they went over the summary together, her sitting across from him in the visitor chair while he walked her through each document, each transaction record, each link in the chain. He was thorough and she was thorough, and by the time he closed the folder, they both knew she understood it well enough to present it without him in the room. "You're sure you want to do this without me present?" he asked. "Yes. If he reacts badly, he might react badly," she said. "That's why I want to do it without you present. This needs to happen between us, not between lawyers." Whitaker looked at her with the expression of a man who had his own opinion about this and had made the professional judgment to keep it. If he reacts in any way that makes you feel unsafe, you leave. You don't finish the conversation. You walk out. "I know. And you call me immediately." "I know, Harold." He gave her the folder. She put it under her arm. She walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the elevator. With her jaw set and her shoulders level, and the surgical sight pulling with every other step in a way she'd gotten used to, constant low reminder that her body had been through something it was still recovering from. She was in the conference room by 9:50. It was a neutral room in the specific way of hospital administrative spaces. Nothing personal, nothing comfortable, designed for conversations that needed a table between people. A window looked out onto an internal courtyard. She sat facing the door. She put the folder on the table. She put her hands on either side of it, and she breathed. Nico came in at 10:03. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He was in the suit again. She suspected the suit was armor for him the way her blazer was for her. both of them choosing their presentation deliberately, but there were shadows under his eyes and a tension in the set of his shoulders that he couldn't quite control. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face. She'd stood up. She hadn't planned to. Her body had made the decision, some instinct about not receiving him from a lower position, and she was standing with her hands resting on the table and the folder between them. "Sit down," she said, not a request. She sat across from him. She opened the folder and turned it to face him and slid it across the table. He looked down at the first page. Then he picked it up and started reading. She watched him read. She watched his eyes move across the lines of text, the document headers, the transaction records. She watched the controlled stillness of his face as it processed what his eyes were sending it. She watched him turn the first page, the second, stop at the third. His hand tightened on the paper. "These intermediary firms," he said. His voice was completely flat. "They appear in both chains," she said. "The row Vanguard investment structure and the secondary position." The secondary position as he stopped. Started again. "The secondary position traces back to whom?" "We haven't been able to confirm ownership definitively," she said. "But the timeline, the access required, and the specific vehicles used." She paused. "Someone with detailed knowledge of your internal financial structures built this, Nico. Someone who had access to both sides." He was very still. "How long?" he said. "The earliest transactions we can identify are from 2021, 2 years ago." The words came out quiet and separate, like he was counting them. "Yes." He turned the next page. "Read it." His jaw was doing the thing, the back teeth pressing, the controlled tension, but it was different now. The quality of it was different. She could see the difference, even across the table. Before it had been about managing what he showed her. Now it was about managing something internal, something that had no clean outlet. He reached the last page. He set it down. He did not look up immediately. "Serena," he said. "She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to." "The access required," he said slowly. "The specific investment vehicles." "Timing." He looked up. His eyes were doing something she'd never seen in them, something that was past anger, past calculation, something rawer and colder. "She's been building a position inside my organization. That's what the records indicate. For 2 years. At minimum." He pushed back from the table, stood up. Moved to the window. She watched his back, the set of it, the barely contained energy of a man who needed to hit something and had nowhere to put it. He put both hands on the window frame and looked out at the courtyard and breathed. And she could see the breathing from across the room, the deliberate expansion and contraction of his shoulders. She waited. "Why are you telling me?" he said to the window. "Because you were going to find out," she said. "And because when you did, I wanted you to have found out from the person who hasn't been lying to you." Turned, looked at her. The rawness in his eyes was still there. "That's a generous way of describing someone who had a trust fund hidden from their husband. I didn't know about the trust fund, but you accepted it." "Yes," she said, "because my son needed surgery and your lawyers were trying to slow it down." The word surgery landed in the room. She watched it land. Watched him receive it. "I withdrew that motion," he said. "You did," she said, "and I noticed." He moved back to the table. Didn't sit. Stood with his hands on the back of the chair, looking at the folder, looking at the documents that were going to require him to have a conversation with Serena Vale that she suspected would be the worst of both their lives. "The board meeting," he said, "in 3 days. You know Rice filed with them." Yes, he looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not softening, not exactly, but a change in what was on the surface. The calculation was still there. It was always there. She'd come to understand it was just how his mind worked, the constant assessment. But underneath it, something was moving that was less strategic. "If I pulled the board filing," he said slowly, "if Rice withdrew from the board process." She waited. "What would that cost me?" he said. It wasn't a negotiating question. It was a genuine one. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm not asking you to do it, but it would change things." "It would change some things," she said. "Not everything." He looked at the folder again. "She sat in my office," he said. "This morning. I had a meeting at 8 and she was there and she was..." He stopped. She was talking about the custody case, about strategies. Maddie said nothing. "She knows about the board meeting," he said. She suggested the board approach. She said it was the fastest way to freeze the trust. He looked up. "She told me to file the injunction." The room was very quiet. Maddie understood the full geometry of it now, seen from his angle. Serena had pushed the injunction not to help Nico's custody case. She'd pushed it because a frozen trust created a legal environment in which her own secondary investment position became the dominant financial relationship. If Roe Vanguard was frozen and the Barone Group needed capital, they'd turn to the available source. Her source. She was using the divorce, Maddie said quietly. Custody filing, all of it, as cover. To get control of my assets, Nico said. Or significant leverage over them. He picked up the folder and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the handle. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. She could see the tension in the line from his shoulders to his jaw. The board meeting, he said again. If she's there, she'll argue in favor of freezing the trust, Matty said. Because it serves her position, not yours. He turned, looked at her. And if I tell Rice to withdraw, then you and I deal with each other, she said. Without her in the middle, he held her gaze for a long moment. Then he left. She sat down. Her legs had been steady the whole time, and they'd been steady because she'd needed them to be. And now the room was empty, and she let them shake, just briefly, just for a moment. A small private concession to the fact that her body was still recovering from surgery, and she'd just spent 45 minutes in the most important conversation of the last decade. She breathed through it, in and out. Then she picked up her phone and called Whitaker and said, "Get me ready for the board meeting." 2 things happened in the next 36 hours that she hadn't planned for. The first was Carter. At 4 in the afternoon, on the day after the conference room meeting, Dr. Okafor called her directly. Carter's condition had shifted. Not catastrophically, Okafor was careful about that word, careful about all the heavy words, which was one of the reasons Maddie trusted her, but significantly. His respiratory indicators had dropped in a way that made the scheduled procedure more urgent, not less. Okafor wanted to move it up, not by days, by hours. She wanted to do it the following morning instead of the day after. Does that change anything on your end? Okafor asked. Not meaning medically, meaning legally, no, Maddie said. Do it tomorrow. I'll need your signature on updated consent forms tonight. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 15. She signed the forms standing at the NICU nursing station with a pen someone handed her, and her hand did not shake. Okafor watched her sign and said, "He's a fighter. You should know that. The data on his respiratory recovery, over the last 48 hours he's working hard. He gets it from someone," Maddie said. Okafor almost smiled. Almost. She went in to see Carter after the forms were signed. The overnight nurse, a young man named Dale, who'd been on the NICU rotation since the beginning, and who had, over 11 days, become someone Maddie thought of with the particular warmth she reserved for people who showed up quietly and reliably stepped back to give her space. She put her hand through the porthole. Carter gripped her finger. She talked to him for 20 minutes. She told him about tomorrow. She told him the team knew what they were doing. She told him she would be right there, right outside, the entire time. She told him she was not going anywhere. All you do is be here, she said to him. It's enough. Being here is enough. She drove herself back. She'd started driving 2 days ago, carefully, hating the dependence on the wheelchair, and she sat in the hospital parking structure for a while before going back up, because sometimes you needed a place that was neither the NICU, nor her room, nor someone's waiting area. Sometimes you needed a concrete ceiling and the sound of distant traffic and 3 minutes of not being watched. The second thing happened the next morning. She was in the waiting area outside the surgical suite. Carter had gone in at 7:15, which was earlier than either she or the surgical team's comfort preferred, but earlier than the alternative of waiting another day, when her phone lit up with a number she recognized. Rice and Partners. She stared at it for a moment. Then she answered. It wasn't the smooth-voiced lawyer from before. It was a different voice, older, more senior. She could hear the seniority in it, the measured weight of a man accustomed to calling the shots rather than executing them. Mrs. Barone. My name is William Rice. I'm calling personally. I know who you are, she said. I'll be brief, Mr. Barone has instructed us to withdraw from the board proceeding. The injunction request has been suspended pending further review. A pause. He's also asked me to communicate, and I'm conveying this exactly, that the medical authorization for all 3 children remains solely with you. She closed her eyes for 1 second. All right, she said. There's a condition, Rice said. She opened her eyes. There always is. He wants a meeting. Not legal, not through us. He wants to speak with you directly before the board convenes. He says you'll understand why. She thought about the folder. About Serena. About what Nico was dealing with on his end right now, and what he needed from her in order to deal with it. Tell him tomorrow, she said. Carter goes in today. I'm not leaving this hospital until I know how he came out. Pause. I'll relay that, Mr. Rice. She kept her voice level. Tell your client that the next time he wants to communicate with me about our children, he should pick up the phones himself. She hung up. She sat in the waiting area for 2 hours and 40 minutes. There was a television mounted in the corner, showing a morning news program she didn't watch. There was a coffee machine in the hallway she used once and regretted. There were 3 other families in the waiting area at various points, none of whom she spoke to, all of whom she was aware of the way you're aware of other people in the same weather. At 9:58, Okafor came through the door. She stood before Okafor finished crossing the room. Okafor's face was professional, controlled, carrying the particular expression of someone bringing news that isn't the worst news. He's done, Okafor said. The procedure went well. He's in recovery now. Maddie's hand went to her mouth. She hadn't planned that either. The body doing what it did when the held thing releases. He's okay? He's okay. He'll need monitoring, but the surgical outcome was what we hoped for. Okafor looked at her. You can see him in about an hour. She sat back down. The chair received her. She sat with her hand still at her mouth and breathed and let the shaking happen this time. Let it move through her and out. Didn't manage it. Thank you, she said. Her voice was barely a voice. That's my job, Okafor said. But she put a hand briefly on Maddie's shoulder as she passed a quick, unprofessional, entirely human gesture, and then she was gone. Maddie sat there alone for a while, breathing. Carter was okay. She had 2 days until the board meeting. She pulled out the notebook. She had 6 pages of notes, things she'd written over the last 3 days in the margins and on the backs of pages and in whatever space she could find. Arguments, counter-arguments, the financial history of Roe Vanguard. What Whitaker had told her about her father's intentions. What she understood about the board members she'd done her research, asked Langford, built a picture of who each person was and what they valued and what they feared. And she had one other thing. She had what Nico was going to give her. She didn't know yet exactly what it would be. But she knew he was going to give her something, some piece of what he knew, some portion of what he'd learned about its position inside his organization, because he needed her to walk into that board meeting and win. Not for her sake, because if she lost and the trust was frozen, and Serena's position became dominant, Nico lost too. And Nico Baroni, whatever else he was not a man who lost without fighting. They were going to fight together, briefly, badly, with the wreckage of their marriage between them and 3 boys in incubators as the only clean thing left. She thought about what she'd said to him in the conference room. I wanted you to have found out from the person who hasn't been lying to you. She thought about whether that was true. She had not lied to him. She had also not been fully who she was, and those were different things, but not entirely separate. She'd walked into their marriage as Maddie Rowe, pretending to be only Maddie, setting down the weight of a name she hadn't wanted, and she hadn't lied about any of it. She'd genuinely not known about the trust. Genuinely not known about her father's investment, but she'd also not looked closely enough at the things she'd left behind her when she'd walked away. She'd made it easy for Nico to not see her clearly by not fully seeing herself. That wasn't an excuse for what he'd done. It was just true. And she was tired of not looking at true things directly. She was going to walk into that boardroom, and she was going to look at everything directly. She was going to tell them who she was. Her phone buzzed. Whitaker. She answered it and said, Carter's procedure is done. He's okay. She could hear Whitaker exhale. Good, he said. I'm glad. Rice called me this morning. Nico's withdrawing from the board process. He wants a meeting before the hearing. Do you want me present for? No, she said. I'll tell you after. A pause. Maddie. The board is prepared to be hostile. Several of the members have existing relationships with the Barone Group business relationships. They have reasons to prefer Nico's position. I know. You're going to be walking into a room that is not on your side. I know, Harold. What are you going to say to them? She looked at the notebook, at the 6 pages of arguments and counter-arguments and research and preparation. She thought about her father, building a trapdoor and not telling her it was there, because he'd known she'd refuse it. She thought about Richard Rowe, difficult and demanding and privately devoted, loving her in the only way he knew how, which was by building things that lasted. She thought about 3 boys down the hall, Carter recovering from surgery, Leo sleeping with his fists curled, James tracking a light with his eyes for 4 seconds. She thought about what she was willing to do, and what she was willing to lose, and what she was not willing to lose under any circumstances. She knew what she was going to say. The truth, she said. And the board meeting was in 2 days, and Serena Vale did not yet know what was coming, and Nico Baroni was somewhere in this building, making decisions that would determine whether they were going to fight this last part together or apart. And Carter was breathing on the other side of a set of double doors with Okafor's team watching over him. Maddie Rowe closed the notebook, stood up, and walked toward those doors. The meeting with Nico happened the evening before the board convened. She'd chosen the hospital conference room again, the same table, the same window onto the courtyard, the same chairs. She'd chosen it deliberately neutral ground that was also hers, a room she'd already won something in, a room that carried the memory of her being steady when she hadn't been sure she could be. He arrived at 7. She was already there. He looked worse than he had 2 days ago. The suit was the same quality, but something in how he carried it had changed, a looseness at the shoulders, a fatigue that the jacket couldn't contain. He'd been dealing with Serena. She could see it on him, the way you see weather that's already passed, the damage of it. He sat down across from her without preamble. She said, "How did it go?" He looked at the table. "I confronted her yesterday morning." She waited. "She didn't deny it," he said. "That was the part I wasn't ready for. I'd expected denial. I'd expected her to have an explanation that made it something other than what it was." He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She just looked at me and said she'd been protecting her position. Like that was reasonable. Like that was a thing a person just says." "What did you say?" "I had her removed from the building." He paused. "Her access to all Barone Group systems is revoked. Her consultancy contract is terminated. Reese is preparing a civil filing. And her investment position? My financial team is working through the legal mechanism to challenge it. Take time." He looked up. She built it carefully. "Going to take careful work to undo." Maddie nodded slowly. "She also," he said, and here his voice shifted, just slightly, a tightening she recognized, "released a statement this afternoon." Before I could get ahead of it, he reached into his jacket and put a printed page on the table between them. She picked it up. It was a statement attributed to Serena Vale, released through a communications firm Maddie didn't recognize. 4 paragraphs. It was professionally written and surgically targeted, and it did 3 things in sequence. It positioned Serena as a whistleblower, exposing financial irregularities within the Barone Group. It implied that Nico had asked her to build the secondary investment structure as a way of obscuring assets from Maddie during the divorce, and it suggested that Maddie's sudden activation of the Roe Vanguard Trust was itself suspicious, a coordinated move between estranged parties designed to evade tax obligations on both sides. Maddie read it twice, set it down. "She's trying to burn both of us," she said. "Yes, by making it look like we're working together. Which as of this week, we have been," he said, flatly. Not an accusation, just the reality of it. She looked at the statement again. Specific architecture of it. The way it took the true thing they had shared information, they had made decisions that affected each other, and reframed it as conspiracy. Good work. It was the work of someone who'd prepared a contingency for this exact scenario, who'd understood that if her position were discovered, she'd need a story that made discovery look like the suspicious part. "She had this ready," Maddie said. "Yes, before you confronted her. She sent it 30 minutes. After I walked out of the building," he said. She'd already written it. Maddie thought about Serena Vale at her desk, with the financial monitoring system open. Serena Vale with her 4 drafts of empathetic press releases. Serena Vale, sitting on the edge of a desk in a dress that cost more than Maddie's first car, laughing at something Nico had said, hand on knee. Performance of it so complete that Maddie had spent 11 days thinking the thing she'd seen was an affair. It wasn't only an affair. It had never been only that. "The board sees this statement before tomorrow's meeting," Maddie said. "They've already seen it." Rice confirmed an hour ago that copies were sent directly to each board member. He looked at her. Maddie, I need you to understand what you're walking into tomorrow. This statement gives them a reason to suspend the trust entirely, pending a full investigation. Not freeze it, suspend it, which is different. How different? A freeze is temporary. A suspension with an investigation attached could run for years. The trust would be functionally unusable while the investigation proceeds. He held her gaze. Your authority as heir would be nominal. She sat with that. And Serena's secondary position, she said, becomes the active financial relationship, he said. Yes, even if we're challenging it legally, an active position during a trust suspension. He stopped. She still wins. From outside the building, she still wins. The room was very quiet. Then I need to make sure the board doesn't suspend, Maddie said. Maddie. His voice carried something she hadn't heard in it before, or hadn't heard in a very long time. They're going to ask you to defend yourself against a tax evasion implication. In a room full of people who have financial relationships with my organization. The day after a damaging statement from someone they considered credible. I know, you've had surgery 2 weeks ago. You have 3 boys in the NICU. Nico? She met his eyes. Are you trying to protect me right now? Stopped. She watched the specific quality of the silence that followed. Watched him sit with the question. Maybe, he said finally. Quiet. Almost nothing. Then here's what you can do, she said. Tomorrow morning, before the meeting, I need your financial team to prepare a document. Clean accounting of the secondary investment chain, not from my side, from yours. Internal Barone Group records showing that the transactions were initiated without your authorization or knowledge. She paused. If those records exist, they exist. Then I need them by 8 tomorrow morning. He looked at her for a long moment. That document implicates my own organization's security failures. Yes, she said, it does. It opens us to regulatory scrutiny. It also makes clear that neither of us built the secondary structure, she said. It corroborates the story I need to tell in that room. And it gives the board something to look at besides Serena's statement. Quiet. She watched him do the calculation. She could see him doing it, the way she'd always been able to see it, the quiet arithmetic of a man weighing costs. She watched him reach the end of the calculation. I'll have it to Whitaker by 7:30, he said. She nodded. She picked up her notebook. She started to stand. Maddie. His voice stopped her. She was half out of her chair, and she stayed there, not sitting back down, not fully standing. After tomorrow. Whatever happens with the board, what does this look like? You and me. She looked at him, really looked at him. The shadows under his eyes, and the looseness in his shoulders, and the particular quality of a man who had spent the last 2 weeks losing things he'd believed, were solid. She looked at him, and she felt the strange compound thing she always felt now, when she looked at him, the grief of what they'd been, or what she'd believed they'd been, layered over the clean, cold knowledge of what he'd done, layered over something else, something she didn't have a clean word for, the residue of 3 years and 3 boys, and a history that was theirs regardless of how it ended. It looks like co-parents, she said. It looks like people who share children and handle that with as much decency as we can manage. She paused. That's the best I can offer you. He nodded once. She stood up. She picked up the statement Serena had released. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket because she was going to need to know every word of it by morning. The boys are doing well, she said at the door. Carter came through the procedure. Leo's oxygen is stable. James tracked a light for 8 seconds today. She looked at him. In case no one told you. Something shifted on his face. The rawness she'd seen before, the thing underneath the calculation. Thank you, he said. She left. She sat in her hospital room until 2 in the morning reading Serena's statement and her own notes and Whitaker's preparation materials. She wrote in the margins. She argued with herself on paper, the best counter she could build against each point the board might raise. And then she argued against those counters, and then she read the whole thing again. At 2:15, she put the notebook down and turned the light off. She lay in the dark and thought about her father, Richard Rowe, who had built a trapdoor and not told her it was there. Who had invested in Nico Barone's organization before the wedding, quietly, through 6 layers of holding structure, creating a legal thread he could pull if he ever needed to. Who had died believing she was angry at him, because she had been angry at him, because she'd thought his brand of love was just control, dressed up in expensive clothes. She'd been partly right. He had been controlling. He had been difficult and demanding, and sometimes cold, and he'd never once simply told her he was afraid for her. He'd built things instead, but he'd also been right about Nico. And the trap door had been there when she needed it. She thought about what it cost to love someone the way her father had loved her. To see something coming and not be able to stop it, only prepare for it. To build something you might never see used. She thought about 3 boys down the hall. She thought about what she was going to build. At 6:45 in the morning, she got up, dressed again in the gray blazer, and walked down to the NICU before breakfast. Dale was on the overnight shift, just finishing. He nodded at her. She nodded back. She went to Carter first. He was smaller than she ever stopped being startled by. 2 weeks old, and the weight of him was still measured in ounces rather than pounds. But his color was better after the procedure, and his monitors were steady, and when she put her hand through the porthole, he did the thing he always did, gripped her finger without opening his eyes, reflexive and absolute. The grip of something that has decided to hold on. "I have to go do something today," she told him. "I'll be back tonight. Leo and James are going to look after you while I'm gone, okay? They're terrible at it. They're babies. They're going to sleep the whole time. They'll be right there." Leo was asleep. James was awake, or as awake as James got, which was a particular quality of stillness that might have been alertness or might have been contemplation, hard to tell with a 2-week-old. She talked to all 3 of them, moving from incubator to incubator, keeping her voice low, just present, just there. Then she went to meet Whitaker in the lobby. The board meeting was held in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building downtown that Maddie had never been in before. Roe Vanguard maintained offices there. She hadn't known that until Whitaker told her yesterday, one of the dozens of things about her inheritance that she was still learning, still mapping. There were 9 board members. She'd researched all of them. 6 had existing business relationships with the Barone Group. 2 were independents her father had appointed for their specific expertise in trust law and estate management. 1 a woman named Cornelia Park, 71, who had been on the board since its inception, had been her father's personal attorney before Whitaker, and had, Whitaker said, known Richard Roe better than almost anyone alive. They were seated when she walked in, Whitaker beside her. She wore the blazer. She carried the notebook. Serena's statement was on the table in front of 4 of them. She sat down. She put the notebook on the table. She looked at each of them in turn, slowly, not performing confidence. She was too tired to perform, just making contact. Establishing that she was a person in the room, not an abstract problem to be solved. The chair of the board was a man named Desmond Falk, 74, who had the manner of someone who had been the most senior person in every room he'd occupied for the last 20 years. He looked at her with the measured distance of a man who had already formed an opinion and was waiting to see if she'd change it. "Miss Barone," he said. "Miss Rowe," she said, not aggressive. Just clear, a slight adjustment around the room. She watched it happen. "Miss Rowe," Falk said, "I think you understand why we've convened. There are serious questions about the circumstances of the trust activation, and a recent statement that has raised additional mine." "I've read the statement," she said. "Then you understand." "I understand what it's designed to do," she said. "I'd like to address it directly, if the board will allow me 15 minutes. Falk looked at the others. A silent transaction. Then he nodded. She opened the notebook. She did not read from it. She'd prepared it as a scaffold, something to catch her if she fell. She didn't fall. She told them about the delivery. About waking up from surgery to an envelope beside her bed. About Carter's respiratory support, and Leo's oxygen drop, and James opening his eyes. She told them these things not for sympathy. She was careful about that. She could feel the room's resistance to sentiment, and she didn't push against it, but because she needed them to understand the context in which every decision had been made. The ground she'd been standing on when she'd had to make choices. She told them about Langford's visit, about her father's investment structure, about the fact that she had not known about Roe Vanguard before Langford came to her room, and that the decision to activate the trust had been made not to gain leverage in a divorce proceeding, but to protect her children's medical authorization from a legal motion that would have delayed Carter's surgery. She put Nico's document on the table, the one his financial team had prepared by 7:30 that morning as promised. clean accounting of the secondary investment chain from the Barone Group's internal records, showing the transactions had been initiated without Nico Baroni's knowledge or authorization. This document, she said, corroborates that neither I nor my estranged husband created the secondary investment structure described in the statement you received yesterday. It was built by a third party with access to both financial systems. The individual responsible has been removed from the Barone Group, and civil proceedings are being prepared. She looked at them steadily. The statement you received was prepared by that individual as a contingency in the event her position was discovered. It is not an account of what happened. It is a last move in a game she'd been running for 2 years. Cornelia Park, who had not moved or spoken since Maddie sat down, said, "How do we know this document is accurate?" "You can have your own forensic accountants verify it," Maddie said. "I'd recommend that you do. But the internal timestamps on the transactions, cross-referenced with the Roe Vanguard activation date, will show you that the secondary position predates my knowledge of this trust by at least 2 years." A man 3 seats down one of the 6 with Barone Group relationships said, "Your father built this trust specifically to create leverage over the Barone Group's assets." That's what these records indicate, which raises a question about the nature of the original investment. She'd been waiting for this one. She'd known it was coming. "My father built this trust," she said, "because he knew his daughter was marrying someone he didn't trust. He couldn't stop her, couldn't stop me, so he built something that would give her standing if the worst happened." She paused. "He was correct about the situation. He was wrong about the method. I wish he'd told me. I wish he'd trusted me with it rather than around it, but I understand why he didn't." She looked at the man who'd asked the question. "He was trying to protect me. He just did it in the way of a man who'd spent 50 years in business and had forgotten there were other ways." Something moved around the table. She couldn't name it exactly. A shift in the quality of attention. "I didn't claim this inheritance because I wanted an empire," she said. She looked at each of them as she said it. "I didn't want it at 24, which is why I walked away from it. I didn't want it 3 months ago. I want it now because my children needed someone powerful enough to protect them, and I was the only person available for that job." She closed the notebook. Cornelia Park had her eyes on her. Not warm, the woman's gaze was not warm, exactly, but attentive, in a way that felt different from the others, more personal, like she was looking for something specific. "Your father talked about you," Park said. "Not to the room. To Maddie." Maddie looked at her. "I know he was worried about me." "He was proud of you," Park said. "He thought you were the only person he knew who'd had what he'd built and walked away from it on principle." A pause. "He also thought you'd come back to it eventually. On your own terms." The room was quiet. "He was right about a lot of things," Maddie said. "I'm still working through which ones." The board deliberated for 40 minutes. She and Whitaker waited in a smaller room down the hall. He brought her coffee. She didn't drink. She sat with the notebook open on her knee and didn't write anything in it, just held it. "You did well," Whitaker said. "I don't know yet," she said. Cornelia Park moment. "I didn't plan that," she said. "I know. That's why it worked." She looked at the window. The city 42 floors below, which from this height looked like a pattern, like something organized, all the movement reduced to something that looked purposeful. She knew it wasn't. She'd learned that much. Whitaker's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "They're ready," he said. She walked back into the room. Falk was standing. That was different. He'd been seated before, he said. "The board has voted to retain Maddie Elise Rowe as trust heir and to confirm the validity of the activation proceeding." He paused. "Furthermore, in light of the evidence presented regarding the secondary investment structure and the circumstances of the legal filings against the trust, the board has voted to appoint Ms. Rowe as chairwoman of Roe Vanguard Holdings, effective immediately, with full authority over trust decisions." She stood very still. Chairwoman, not just heir, not just the name on the papers. Falk looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has updated his opinion about something and is too old to pretend he hadn't needed updating. "Your father built something designed to last," he said. "The board believes you understand that better than he gave you credit for." She said, "Thank you." The words were ordinary and inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were what she had. Outside, in the hallway, Whitaker stopped walking and just looked at her for a moment. He looked like a man whose professional composure was doing battle with something more personal, and the professional composure was winning, but only barely. Your father would have, he started. I know, she said. She said it gently, not to stop him, just because she knew, and she didn't need the sentence finished to have it. He nodded. They stood in the hallway for a moment, both of them quiet, the fluorescent light above them, making everything look slightly more ordinary than it was. Then she said, I need to get back to the hospital. The Barone Group's collapse was not immediate. These things never are. They take time. The unraveling of something built over years, it happens in increments, in regulatory filings and quiet departures and assets that stop producing the returns they once did. The investigation that opened into the organization's financial practices was a slow-moving thing, methodical, the kind that takes 18 months and produces results that are difficult to argue with. Nico did not fight it directly. She'd thought he might. He didn't. He negotiated, which was always what he was best at. And what he negotiated was a structured cooperation agreement with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, which gave him reduced personal exposure in exchange for information about the organization's structure that certain people very much wanted. It was not heroic. It was not a moment of moral revelation. It was a man making the most rational choice available to him and doing it with his eyes open. She didn't hate him for it. She didn't forgive him either. She wasn't in the business of forgiving him. She was in the business of getting her children home. Carter came home 6 weeks after his birth. He came home on a Tuesday, in a car seat she'd installed herself with Marcus, watching from the driver's seat and offering no commentary whatsoever, which she appreciated. The seat was slightly too large for him, and he sat in it like something placed in a vessel not quite fitted to his size. But his numbers were good, and Okafor had said the word ready, with the flat certainty that Maddie had learned, meant it. Leo came home 4 days later, James the day after that. The house she brought them to was not the Barone estate. She'd let that go during the legal proceedings cleanly, without fighting for it, because she hadn't wanted it. She'd moved into a house in a neighborhood that was quiet without being isolated, with a room she'd painted herself badly, with visible roller marks on the upper corners, the specific shade of green she'd chosen from a paint chip at the hardware store on a Saturday afternoon that felt for the hour she was there very much like an ordinary life. She had nurses, because she wasn't reckless, and 3 preemies required continuity of care. She had Marcus, who drove her and occasionally appeared at the door with groceries he'd decided she needed without being asked. She had Whitaker, who called every Tuesday at 9 with a status update on the Roe Vanguard transition, and Langford, who stopped by the house twice and sat in the kitchen, drinking tea he brought himself, and talking about her father in the careful way of someone who is both protecting a memory and releasing it. She had Dana Cho, her original lawyer, who'd taken to texting her links to things she thought Maddie should read, articles about women running holding companies, about NICU graduates at age 5, at 10, at 20, about things that had nothing to do with anything, except that Dana thought of her and sent them. She had, in the specific and limited way they'd negotiated, Nico. Came every Saturday. She'd proposed the schedule and he'd accepted it without modification, which she'd taken as a sign that he understood the structure of what they were building, something careful and bounded, not warm but not hostile. The architecture of parents who are not each other's people anymore and have decided to be decent about it anyway. Good on Saturdays. She watched him with the boys the way he held Carter, who was still small enough to fit in the crook of one arm, and seemed to know it was a good place to be, the way Leo grabbed his finger with the grip that all 3 of them had. The Rowe family grip, it turned out. Langford had told her her father had the same grip. People had commented on it, and she watched him be genuinely there with them. Not performing. Just present. It was the best version of him. She'd known it existed. She was glad the boys got it on Saturdays. They didn't talk much when he came. Logistics, the boys' progress, scheduling. Once, in the kitchen while she made coffee, and he was in the living room floor, with all 3 of them at once, which was chaos mild, the good kind. She heard him laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, startled out of him by something James did, and it traveled through the house to where she was standing, and she stood very still for a moment, listening to it. Then she finished making the coffee and brought him a cup, and he said thank you, and they sat for a while, watching the sun, not speaking, which was sometimes all you could do. Serena Vale's civil case was ongoing. She'd retained her own lawyers and was fighting the challenge to her investment position, which was her right. The case would take time. Maddie did not spend time thinking about it. Not because she was above it, but because she had 3 boys who were learning that they had weight in the world, actual literal weight that increased week over week and was measured at every pediatric appointment with the kind of attention she'd once applied to legal documents. Carter, at 3 months, weighed 8 pounds, 2 ounces. Leo was 9 pounds. James was 9'4". She kept a notebook specifically for these numbers. A separate one from the one she used for work, for the Roe Vanguard transition, for the restructuring she was doing slowly and carefully, pulling back from the more opaque parts of the holding structure, rerouting investments into things that had a legible relationship with the world she wanted her sons to grow up in. Slow work. It was the right work. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd thought she might, eventually, that there'd come a moment when the weight of what had happened would resolve into something that felt like winning. It didn't come that way. What came instead was quieter. An ordinary Thursday with all 3 boys asleep in the same room for the first time, and her standing in the doorway, watching them breathe, and the specific quality of that moment, which was not triumph, but was perhaps something adjacent to peace. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the woman she'd been on the morning her water broke, standing at a kitchen window with cold tea, and a secret she was trying to decide what to do with. She thought about the recovery room and the envelope and the 14 days that had followed, which had required her to be more than she'd known she was, and also to discover that being more than she'd known she was had been possible the whole time, which was the part that still surprised her sometimes. She thought about her father, building a trap door, not telling her it was there. She understood it now. Not completely, she suspected she'd be understanding it in installments for the rest of her life, but enough. He'd loved her in the way of someone who'd learned too late that telling people what you're building for them is part of the building. He'd gotten it wrong in that specific way and right in all the structural ways, and she was here because of both. She thought about what she wanted to get right. She pushed off the doorframe. She went to the kitchen. She made tea that she actually drank while it was warm, which was a small thing, and also the thing she'd decided to pay attention to the small specific things that meant she was present and not just surviving. Outside the window, the sky was doing something complicated, clouds moving fast above a line of trees, the light changing by the second. She watched it. She had a meeting in the morning, a call with the Roe Vanguard legal team at 9, a pediatric appointment for all 3 boys at 11, and she'd told Marcus she'd drive herself, which she could now, which still felt like something each time. She had things to do, she would do them. Carter made a sound from the other room, not distress. Just a sound, the small announcement of a person who has decided to be awake. She set the mug down. She went to him. He was on his back with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling with the total focused attention that babies give to ceilings, which have apparently always been fascinating. She looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and she had the sudden specific sensation of being seen, really seen, the way a person sees you when they have no agenda, no performance, no strategy, just attention. And it was the closest she'd come in a long time to being wholly in the moment rather than slightly ahead of it, planning the next move. "Good morning," she said to him. He held her gaze. "I know," she said. "There's a lot to look at." She picked him up. He was 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and he fit against her chest with a certainty that was physical, and also something else, something that didn't have a clean word, something she'd stopped trying to name and started just allowing. She stood at the window with her son and watched the light change on the trees. She was the chairwoman of Roe Vanguard Holdings. She was the woman who had signed her name in a hospital bed and changed the direction of everything. She was the person who had walked into a boardroom 2 weeks after surgery and told the truth in a room full of people who hadn't wanted to hear it and had been heard anyway. She was also a woman standing in a kitchen at 6:40 in the morning with a baby against her chest and tea cooling on the counter, in a house with visible roller marks on the upper corners of one room, listening to her other 2 sons breathe. Both of those things were true, and they lived in her at the same time, and she'd stopped finding that contradictory. Started finding it, quietly hers. She didn't go back to sleep after Carter woke. That was the new normal had been since they'd come home. This pattern of early mornings that started before the sun finished deciding what it was doing, before the neighborhood made any sound. In the particular hush of a house that had 3 new people in it who were still learning that night and day were different things. She didn't fight it. She'd stopped fighting the things she couldn't change somewhere around week 3 in the hospital, when she understood that fighting the shape of your circumstances burned energy you needed for the actual work. She carried Carter to the kitchen, made fresh tea, stewed at the counter with him against her shoulder, and drank it while it was warm, which she'd decided was a thing she was going to do now, a deliberate small act of being present rather than always leaning into whatever came next. The house was quiet around them. It was a good house. Not the kind of good she'd once thought she wanted. The Barone estate had been architecturally significant and expensively maintained, and she'd never once in 3 years felt like she'd walked into something that was hers. This house was smaller. It had a squeaky board on the 3rd stair that she'd meant to have fixed and hadn't, and the garden in back was overgrown in a way that would require a full afternoon she hadn't had yet, and the kitchen had a window above the sink that faced east, and in the mornings the light came through it at an angle that hit the counter and turned everything briefly gold. She'd bought it herself. With her own money, her own name on the paperwork, and Whitaker on the phone when she'd signed to ask if she had any questions, and she'd had no questions, only the clean, simple fact of a signature that meant something she'd chosen. Cart made a sound against her shoulder. Not a demand, a comment almost, the soft declarative noise he'd started making that suggested he had opinions about the world and intended to develop them further. "You're right," she said to him. "It's early. We can have opinions about that." Started talking to them more in the last few weeks. In the hospital, she'd talked to them because she'd needed to, because she'd needed something to aim her voice at, something to be present for. Now she talked to them because they responded not in words, not yet, but in the unmistakable language of attention, the way they tracked her voice, the way Carter turned his toward her when she spoke, even when she was across the room, small deliberate movement that still every single time made something catch in her chest. Leo woke at 7. She heard him through the monitor before he fully committed to it, a stirring, then a pause, then the escalating announcement of a person who had decided morning was happening whether anyone else was ready. She brought Carter with her and sat on the edge of the nursing chair in the corner of their room and picked Leo up with her free arm, which was a logistical feat she'd gotten better at, and held them both. Leo against her left side, complaining, and Carter against her right side, still delivering commentary, and James slept through all of it the way James slept through most things. Absolute commitment of someone who had decided rest was a serious undertaking. She looked at her 3 boys in the early light. This was the moment. The one she'd been promised, she supposed, by every cliché about motherhood she'd ever half listened to at baby showers for other people. She'd expected it to feel different. Bigger, maybe, or brighter, some internal swell of something cinematic. It didn't feel like that. It felt like her shoulder was starting to ache, and Leo was getting worked up about the fact that morning had the audacity to exist, and Carter was chewing on the collar of her shirt, and James was going to sleep for another 20 minutes, regardless of anything any of them did. It felt exactly like what it was, and what it was hers. She'd had a conversation with Langford the week before, sitting in her kitchen with his tea and her coffee, that she'd been turning over since. He'd been talking about her father something specific, a memory of Richard Rowe in his last year, a conversation they'd had about what he was building and why. Langford had said carefully that Richard had not expected to be understood, that he'd made peace with the possibility that Maddie would activate the trust and never fully know what he'd intended, and that this had not changed his decision to build it. She'd asked Langford why. He'd looked at his tea. Then he'd said he thought love that requires understand to function is fragile. He wanted to build something that worked regardless. She'd been quiet for a long time after that. She thought about it now, holding her boys in the morning light. The particular kind of love that builds things, that makes preparations for futures it might not see. That doesn't require acknowledgement to keep going. She'd spent years being angry at her father for exactly that quality, the way he'd loved her by building, instead of by saying the way he'd protected her without asking if she wanted protection. She was still, in some part of herself, a little angry about it. She suspected she always would be, but she was also standing in that room with his great-grandchildren, her sons, his legacy in a way he hadn't planned, but would have recognized something else. Something she was still finding the edges of. Grateful was too simple. It was sad. It was both of those, and also a kind of respect, the hard-earned kind, the kind that comes when you've done the thing you once couldn't imagine doing, and you look back at the person who prepared you for it and understand, for the first time, what they were actually doing. He'd been right. He'd just never told her. She was going to tell her sons. Not today. They were 10 weeks old. They didn't need philosophy. They needed milk and warmth and the sound of her voice. But someday, she was going to tell them what it cost, what she'd gone through, not as a story of triumph, but as a story of what you do when you're afraid and exhausted. And the person who should have been beside you isn't, and you do it anyway, and it's harder than it should be, and it works. She was going to tell them, you can be scared and still move. You can be broken somewhere and still hold. You can lose the thing you thought was your whole life and find out your whole life was always larger than that one thing. She was going to tell them when they were old enough to hear it, when they had their own moments of standing in kitchens at 6:40 in the morning trying to figure out what they were. James woke at 7:22 with the calm, self-possessed manner he'd had since birth, which Okafor had once called, with professional neutrality, highly individual. He simply opened his eyes and looked at her, as though he'd been awake for a while, and had simply been waiting for an appropriate moment to announce it. "Good morning," she said to him. He looked at her with his father's jaw and her eyes, and some third thing that belonged to neither of them, something entirely his own, and she thought, that's going to be something to see. All three of them were going to be something to see. She was going to be here to see it. That was the whole plan, she'd decided. The full architecture of what came next, reduced to its essential structure. Be here, do the work. Tell them the truth about what things cost. Don't build trapdoors. Build doors, regular ones, and leave them open. Row Vanguard would take years to fully reshape. She knew that. She wasn't in a hurry in the way she once would have been. There was a version of herself, the version from 3 months ago, from before the kitchen window and the cold tea, who would have attacked it, driven by the urgency of proving something. She didn't need to prove anything now. She needed to build something that lasted, that worked, that her boys could look at someday and understand what it had been made for. That was enough. That was, it turned out, the whole point. Marcus knocked at 8:15. She heard the knock before he'd finished making it. She'd learned the particular sound of his knock, the restrained precision of it. A man who'd spent years announcing himself to people who valued their privacy, and she went to the door with Carter still on her shoulder and opened it. He was holding a bag from the bakery 2 streets over. He held it out. He didn't say anything. "You didn't have to," she said. "I was passing it," he said. She took the bag. She stepped back from the door to let him in, and he came in the way he always came in, without excess, finding a place to stand in the kitchen that was out of the way. "How are they today?" he said, looking at Carter. "Good. Leo's got opinions. James is philosophically calm. Carter's writing his memoirs." She set the bag on the counter. "Sit down, Marcus." He sat. He did it the way he sat when he decided he was off the clock, not the watchful stillness of a driver, but the settled heaviness of a man who'd been on his feet a long time and was giving his knees a break. She made him coffee. He didn't ask for it. She made it the way he took it, which she knew because she paid attention, because he'd paid attention to her when she'd needed it most, and attention was one of the things she knew how to give back. They sat at the kitchen table, Carter on her lap, the morning light coming through the window above the sink. Marcus drank his coffee, and she ate something from the bakery bag, and they didn't fill the quiet because it didn't need filling. After a while, Marcus said, "My daughter wants to meet them." The boys. He said it to his coffee. She said to ask when you were ready. No rush. She looked at him. "Bring her whenever you'd like." He nodded, drank his coffee. She thought about the day he'd stood in her hospital room doorway, with his hat in his hands, and told her about the offer he'd refused. She thought about the specific cost of that, the money he'd turned down, the risk of turning it down, the calculation he'd done, and the answer he'd arrived at, and what it had meant for her at exactly the moment she'd needed it most. She owed him something that couldn't be settled with a paycheck. She knew it. She suspected he knew it too, and that he'd never say so, because that was who he was. She looked at her son on her lap, at Marcus across the table, the light on the counter. "Thank you," she said. Not for the bakery bag. He'd know. He met her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at his coffee. "Good coffee," he said. She almost laughed. She let herself. It was a small sound in a quiet kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and it traveled out through the window into the early air of a day that had no disasters scheduled, no filing, no confrontations. Nothing required of her except to be present for the hours as they came. She was here. She was upright. She was the chairwoman of a holding company and the mother of 3 boys who were learning what weight felt like in the world. She had roller marks in the corners of one room and a squeaky board on the 3rd stair and a garden she hadn't gotten to yet. She had things to build. She was going to start today.